Hey, welcome back to Next Wealth Insights. My name is Heather Hopkins, founder and managing director of Next Wealth. I'm joined by my co-host, Alistair Walker, managing director of Optimum Path Financial Planning and a chartered financial planner. Hello, Alistair, and great to be able to introduce you with your new company name.
Hi, Heather. Thank you. Great to be back for episode 8, which is our final episode of this season. Bit bittersweet for me because I've really enjoyed making it with you. And thanks for remembering the new company name. Yeah, we just recently changed, so in a bit of a transition there. So yeah, this is the last podcast of the season and the last companion podcast to the AI Lab membership group for now, at least. Long live the humans. I'm really excited about speaking with today's guest, who I'm sure you'll introduce in a sec for us, Heather. But before we dive in, of course, none of this would be possible without our sponsors. So thank you very much to Salesforce, SS&C, Aviva, and Fidelity. Over to you, Heather, to introduce today's guest.
Today's guest will be no stranger to listeners, Nick Eatock, CEO at intelliflo. And in researching this, I went back to an article, an interview I did in 2017 with Nick, and it was one of my favorite because it was such an eye-opener to Nick's background as a video game designer. So, Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Very nice to be here. Hi, Heather. Hi, Alistair. I must admit, you posted that on LinkedIn, I think, and I had another look, and it took me back. It was a good fun interview.
It was fun. And we're delighted to be speaking with you today about AI because, intelliflo is one of the larger tech providers to financial advice firms. And this podcast series is all about how financial advice firms are integrating AI into their businesses. And so, just to kick things off, I'd be really interested to hear a bit about your approach within intelliflo to using AI and thinking about how you're using it in the business, but also within the products that you're offering in the market.
Yeah, I think like most businesses, everyone's on their different path with AI, and they're exploring it or using it actively in different ways. And when I think about within our own business, we use it quite extensively all the way through the development position itself. So our development teams use AI to help them deliver better code. Essentially, it helps them get through that process. It takes out some of the perhaps more tedious aspects of coding and gets you right to the cutting edge to do the bits that humans make a difference on. And I think that's a kind of an important message about AI in general. It's not actually, we haven't found that it has replaced people. It's replaced some of the jobs that are perhaps less meaningful, and actually humans can make a difference on top of that rather than be relegated to the side. We use it through onboarding process as well. AI is quite an interesting one because I think generative AI gets all the headlines, and probably rightly so. It's probably the more exciting bit of the elements, but there are other bits to it as well. So RPA is a big part of AI in general in terms of the family, so robotic process automation, and you can do an incredible number of things with RPA using multiple different systems, and it kind of gets you, if you're using third-party solutions that don't have strong APIs, RPA can be quite a good way of working with those solutions. So we tend to use it in a range of different methods, and then definitely machine learning and interrogating data and so on is a core part of how we run the business, how we look at our what our teams do, what our customers do, what our users do, and so on. So machine learning is pretty important in terms of optimizing the business. And then I guess turning to the product, we kind of have a multi-strategy there really. One is that we want to continue. We've always been an open architecture business. Built the first main scale sort of API and store in the marketplace. And that comes from a philosophical point of view that advice firms should be able to choose the technology partners that they want, and it's not just one partner; it may be 5 or 6, for example, and therefore those partners should provide a means by which integrated solutions are a reality. So we follow exactly the same philosophy with AI. There are maybe eight to 10 AI specific vendors in the marketplace. at the moment, and we integrate with almost all of them, I think, and want to provide a way in which those firms can. Um, uh, and then alongside that, we have our own AI agenda too. So we're building lots of capability, working with perhaps some of the global firms, sort of Amazon, Microsoft, people like that, in terms of putting stuff together that's going to sit within the product and complement what other firms are doing too. So, I think it's interesting that the whole term an AI vendor, I think eventually is just going to go away because all software vendors will use AI in some part within their offering. At the moment, it's quite easy just to categorize, but I think that will all just disappear anyway.
Is there anything that users of intelliflo might be using that has some sort of AI processing, machine learning processing in the background that we as users may not realize? So are there ways we're interacting with the system already that are being driven by that kind of process and programming?
More in terms of the stuff we're doing internally, Alistair, it's more about our analytics and understanding what firms are doing so we can optimize the solution to make sure it's better in different ways. So
Mm.
when we evolve the solution, we used to get feedback just from users and customers, and they can leave that on our community and leave ideas, and we still do all of that. But now we complement that with information that we're getting directly back and using AI to interrogate and get a better understanding about how people are. And very often it just reinforces what users are telling us themselves. Sometimes it identifies some different things that people haven't told us, and that's probably the most interesting section. And sometimes it's a little bit contradictory to what we're hearing. So that bit I don't know what we do with, but
One thing that I get from other advisors, users of your product, because of course you are, I believe, the biggest sort of back office CRM provider in the UK, is a feeling that they'd really like, oh, if only this bit of tech that I'm using would interface properly. And I think there's a case of kind of integrations and integrations. How deeply integrated are things? Can things post and write and rewrite and edit existing data on the system? Um, do you get a feeling as a business of pressure from users to kind of really open up all of those bits that you may be a little bit more cagey about letting, some random new vendor open up with?
Yeah, I think so. Our general approach here is to try and make sure that as much of the system can be accessed as possible. But you do also then, when you're looking at specific vendors, have to be sure from our perspective that we're not going to be opening up an area that someone may abuse in some way, which then compromises a firm's client data, because obviously that's not great at all. So there's a level of due diligence we have to do with all the vendors, partners who use our store. We've got about 130 odd people using, or 130 firms rather, using the store and APIs now, in terms of third parties. And so it's really important that we understand who they are, what they do, and some due diligence, the due diligence we go through with any what we call vendor or partner onboarding to understand that. At the same time, ultimately, the advice firm has to make a choice here too and understand where the data is going. I think one of the interesting things with AI vendors, but in truth it kind of applies to any vendors, it's just more obvious with AI vendors, is that there's a range of third-party tools that those AI vendors will be using themselves in order to provide their service, and that might just be one of the big main, OpenAI or whoever it is behind the scenes, but it might be four or five, and I think advice firms have to understand that too. It was very interesting at your session earlier this week, on that whole approach. Really, how do advice firms understand how to do due diligence on AI vendors in particular, and it's definitely challenging. It's challenging for really big firms, and when you think of the average size of an advice firm in the UK, it's not a big they're not big firms, so they don't have the wherewithal, the time, or the knowledge necessarily to be asking the right questions. So I do think that there's something that needs to happen there to make it better.
That's a really interesting point, and yeah, we had Dominika Sharetska-McKirk, who's a sort of due diligence expert, speak at the AI Lab event that you attended this week as we were recording, Nick, and she, I think, had 77 questions that a firm should be asking a potential AI a potential AI software provider. And it made me think there's an old coaching question that says, how do people buy a car? What data do they use to buy a car? You might think it's miles per gallon or it's safety ratings or whatever. And the coaching answer is no, they decide they like the car and then backfill with things that sound like they make sense.
Yeah,
And I do wonder how much of that's going on with us as sort of financial advisors. We see a cool bit of tech and we go, right, how do we make this fit the model? On due diligence and on asking 77 questions and on it needing to get better, it's interesting actually. I wonder if there might be a role in the big players, thinking about intelliflo as an example, actually sharing some of their own due diligence data. I kind of have this idea that if the same 77 questions are being asked by 350 different firms, there must be a way to, for us to kind of share and share alike and all get better. Um, any thoughts on that? Would that be too much like you choosing software providers for
yeah. I,
customers or?
I think there is a certain danger in that actually everyone ends up just relying on that when we're not a standards body, and there are standards bodies out there. And I think actually for me that's probably the way in which I think this may be best sorted. So if you think of some of the security and process standards, people like ISO 27001, in order to pass ISO 27001, you have to go through a heck of a lot of time and effort to demonstrate this is what we do as a business, and here's some examples that show you this is how we work. I think that's probably one of the questions I would ask of any vendor out there. So the one I hear, I mean, security is a big thing, right? And the thing that slightly frustrates me that I hear all the time is people saying, we've been told that the vendor, and this isn't necessarily just about AI, this could be anything, or any technology supplier, is they support end-to-end encryption, so things must be right.
Mm,
That's just like one part and probably the least worrying part of the whole process. It's what happens when the data gets at the other end, what other systems are being used, what's the data flow, understanding that in its entirety. That's probably the more relevant set of questions. And how do people, human beings within those vendors, then operate with the data, and what are the securities and controls and processes around that? Those are the things that actually probably matter more than the end. Not saying end-to-end encryption is not a good thing, because of course it is, but it's only one element of the overall defense, if you like. So yeah. And if you go through an ISO process or SOC 2 or any of those, then you have to answer those questions as a vendor. You can't sort of shy away from them. So having gone
mm.
through that process is probably a pretty good barometer for you as an advice firm in terms of your choice.
That's really interesting to hear, and is that classic case of knowing what good questions to ask are and what good looks like in terms of answers. And so I think that's really helpful. Thank you.
Our chief security officer tells me all the time. He says, right, these are the new threats this week. There are new threats arrive every single week. So actually, you as an advice firm using tech have to rely on the fact that actually the technology vendor has got processes, procedures, people, and systems in place to make sure that they keep up to date with everything that's happening and keep addressing that. It's not yeah, this was done 6 years ago and I'm sure it's still fine, because it's not going to necessarily be. You need, and ultimately, I think that comes, as often these things do. We buy things off people fundamentally, and people within firms, yes, but people first. And you've got to believe that their attitude to security and data is kind of, the prime thing that they do, and then the functionality sits on top of that, but the foundations are strong in principle.
It's really it's such an important topic and it's so fraught, isn't it? And in our survey that we did last week, was 20% of respondents from a survey of 200 financial advice professionals across the UK, nationally representative sample, 20% said their firms using AI. And one of the main reasons why was the nervousness, the, how do you select a vendor that you can trust? Is it worth the risk? And so 40% said that they're not at all confident in being able to assess the suitability of AI tech providers, and 25% said that they're only slightly comfortable in their ability to assess the suitability. And if you think you can rely on big tech providers and then hear stories about, hackings at Meta and all these massive firms, it does make people quite nervous, and then they question the reasons. So it is really challenging, but I think that's a good segue into, you know where can AI be used in advice firms. I'd really love your thoughts on this. You had a really interesting piece of research on your website, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. But it highlights some of the challenges of adopting AI. You mentioned the skills that, it's not the firm's fault. No one's going to have a CTO if they've got 5 people in the business, right? Next to us, we don't have a CTO. We've got 12 people in the firm. It's just we don't need that resource. Um, but in terms of the opportunities for firms, you mentioned in that article efficiency, client journeys, and data analytics. I'd just love to hear your thoughts about, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the opportunity for advice firms with this technology?
I think the opportunity is huge, and I think, yeah, I'm always excited at the beginning of every new year in terms of what's going to happen, what's going to change. And I think, but over the last couple of years, AI promises probably more of a leap ahead than almost anything we've seen in the last 10, 15 years or so. You'd probably say the internet itself was the last big leap ahead, or the previous to that. And at the moment, I think if you look at what's being used, there's real value being applied to a small set of use cases in the marketplace by various technology vendors, and they're doing a great job, so that's good. But I think what we will see is we will start seeing AI enhanced capabilities rather than just AI itself. AI enhanced capabilities flex their muscles and cover far more of the advice process as a whole. And that's really important from a compliance process. The more that is covered through a unified journey, the more likely you are to be able to demonstrate consistency, health checks, audit, all of the kind of stuff you expect to do from a compliance process, which is just as important in a small business as it is in a large business, obviously, but then enhanced by elements of the AI to make it actually work more effectively. So I think that's and I think some of that is about bringing some of the bits that we've seen various vendors do today, but into more of a cohesive journey. And some of it's about additional stuff. So I think that's really exciting. I think the whole world of data is a lot of people have said, and rightly said, how important it is. If you're going to get good AI, you need good data first, because that, one sort of is a dependency for the other. And that's absolutely right. What I think is interesting is that actually there's also the potential for systems, and we're doing some great work with Amazon at the moment with a capability there called Amazon Q, which we'll release shortly to the marketplace, is a capability that not only provides you with the ability to see dashboards and create dashboards and all of that kind of stuff, but also uses AI to start interrogating them and enabling you to ask the questions in natural language of saying, well, actually, okay, this is what the dashboard says, but I'd be quite interested to understand if this, and this is the case, or what can you tell me about this? And getting the tool sets to actually work as almost as your expert assistant sat behind you or beside you, without with ultimate ability to respond to your question and actually do it pretty quickly as well.
I think you've touched on something that I've really started picking up on recently, which is that there is that magic moment where you realize that your life has been made easier with a piece of AI. Talking about having, natural language conversations a couple of weekends ago as a project, I decided to enable ChatGPT on my smart home equipment. So rather than, asking Alexa to switch the light on, which is just really turning ourselves into the switch, right? Your voice becomes a switch rather than the light switch on the wall. What I can now say is, it's a bit dark in here. And then it will say, oh, I've switched a couple of lights on for you. Is that better? And then you'll say, oh, actually, it's a bit too bright now. And so they'll switch one light on or take the brightness down to 50%. And it's a conversation and it's weird. You're talking to your home, but it is like, oh, this is what the promise is when it
Yeah.
works anyway.
Yeah. And that's it every year, Alistair, or not every year even, every month that goes by, it has this continual, because AI as a whole is moving so rapidly, there's something new that you discover and you go, oh my gosh, it can do that. It can do that.
Mm.
And that's going to continue. And this, yeah, technology as a whole in general, across the planet for the last 150 years or so. And when I say that, I don't mean just IT technology as we kind of refer it to today, but technology in its wider sense has continually flourished and amazed people and enabled us to do things and continues to move faster than it did the decade before. And we're absolutely going to see that with AI.
Now, you don't need a fantastic data set to be able to turn the lights up or down, but to be able to get a view in your business about, the health of the business, risks, etc., you need a really good set of data. And one of the challenges in our market is the quality of data within advice firms. And I met with with somebody in a one of the bigger consolidators last week who was absolutely delighted because they've got 85% coverage on valuation and transaction level data for clients. And some would say, well, why do you need that really? But they're owned by a PE firm, so they need to report to clients the overall view of their relationship, their financial picture, right? So there's that piece of it, and there's the client piece, which is critical. But there's also they need to know as a business how much have we grown that's organic versus market growth versus the existing clients adding money so that they can report to their owners some of the key financial metrics. But with 85% coverage, which is fantastic, it's still not giving them the full picture. And so, Nick, do you think that providers in the market are doing enough to share data? Do you see progress there? Should they be doing more? Is there something that we can do to make that better?
Yeah, yes, and I think it's a kind of a wider subject than just the providers actually. But yeah, firstly, if we think about providers and the data that sits on platforms and so on, getting that data populated in our world, into practice management systems, because for an advisor, that's where most of their data sits. So that creates a better environment for that to happen. There are APIs to support that, and we wholly support more and more data going through. We've addressed it in a slightly different way as well with a partnership we created with a business called Snowflake. Snowflake's a global leader in data warehousing in general, one of probably the best known company on the planet in that space. And what we do is we provide our data into there and allow firms to have access to that data, but also combine it with other third-party data. So that might be that actually you've got 5 data sets from different places coming together, but you've got one place that you can put them into and then have either a BI tool, or if you're really technical, just SQL queries applying against that, what effectively then becomes a single data set. So that's another way of thinking about that. I think what the bit that often, and I was with a customer yesterday who echoed pretty much the same kind of thing you were saying, Heather, there, but also reinforced it by just kind of core data that they would expect to be in the practice management system, so our solution. And it turned out that part of the reason why it wasn't was because they were using some third parties for doing some stuff who just weren't passing the data back as part of that. So actually, if you're going to use third-party solutions, make sure that the outputs of that, not just documents, but data too, are passed back into the solution. So that integration is really, really important. And if you don't do it that way, start using the inbuilt tools. So as you know, we've got a cash flow planning tool, and we've just got 5,000 users there now utilizing that solution all the time, and that means the data's there. So you've got 2 different routes about that, kind of a best of breed and integrated parties, or kind of doing more of it all in one system. And there's no right or wrong answer in that. It's a subjective choice based on features and functionality, but also integration is the key thing that you can't forget. Because if you don't do that, you can't empower the AI.
I think that's quite a nice opportunity to segue into an area where we perceive, at least in the UK, most of the AI and sort of tech development is happening first. We know you've been spending quite a bit of time in the US with US advice firms, and I think it's quite a common sort of consideration to look west when we're thinking about how we might be adopting sort of new tech trends. So, be really interested to hear from your experiences. How do things compare AI wise in the US to the UK? Is there anything that we could be learning to get a bit of an edge over our sort of other UK advice firms?
I think the trends, Alistair, are fairly similar, and I would also say that the status is fairly similar in both countries. So I guess the key difference in the US is it's naturally a much bigger place, and because of that, there are many, many more suppliers of technology, and those suppliers tend to do a niche element of the advice process. So if you look at your average US advice business, they tend to use much more technology from many more vendors. Sorry, I'll put my teeth back in. I'll start again. So when you look at the average US advice business, they tend to use technology from many more vendors than we might see here in the UK. And that's because the technology that those vendors provide tends to do a smaller part of the overall process. But what that means is that integration is really, really important, but doesn't always apply. And so the integration levels aren't necessarily way ahead of the UK by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that has created a challenge for the adoption of some of these AI solutions. So when I look at the AI solutions in the US, they are very targeted, at the moment at least, around a specific need and a specific area of the advice process. And I think that's good because there's loads of value that can be provided there and those solutions are being adopted. But I think where it would have a maximum impact, and is the kind of thing I was referring to earlier, is when you think about the entire journey, that entire onboarding, advice, and implementation journey. When you can get solutions empowered by AI to cover that whole piece, then you are in a really great place. That's how, as a nation, turning back to the UK now, that's how, in a UK sense, we do widen access to advice because then we make the process much more efficient for a relatively small number of advisors as we have here in the UK, which is hopefully growing, but not growing dramatically, to service a wider range of people. And I think that's really super important. Ultimately, for me, that's one of the promises that AI should help us deliver on.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and particularly interesting to hear that the firms in the US are using perhaps even more different pieces of software that we are. The biggest piece of complaint I have both within my own business from employees and from other advisors I speak to is that, oh gosh, if only we didn't have sort of 7 places we had to go to get this piece of information, and then we go to here, some stuff stored in OneNote and some things are in Excel spreadsheets and others are on a back office software. Um, and if only we could draw it all together. And for me, almost the promise is something that can do that using screen reading, machine learning. I think Claude has just released a big update that promises to do some of that. But again, it's the promise versus the delivery. Um, Also worry about things like terms of business being broken and all those sorts of things if you are using readers. Um, any thoughts on that? Have you had people using that sort of technology on intelliflo? Has that caused an issue?
By definition, I think if you think about it, all of our users use data that has come from multiple places and interrogate it through that. The question is can you actually access, rather than get the data all to come into one place and then interrogate, do you turn it on its head and say, don't bother bringing all the data into one place, but provide tools that can interrogate it whilst it's in numerous places? And I think that's possible. I definitely think that's possible. The biggest worry I would have over that is how you get around the security and authentication to actually make it happen. And that's pretty important. So I mean, I use yeah, as we all do, I'm sure now, use things like Copilot on a regular basis, just to if anything else, if nothing else, just to help me browse more easily and find information more quickly. But it's doing that from the public web, and that's great, and it works really well. When you've got your data in lots of private and secure and protected data stores, as indeed they have to be, how do you use the technology to deal with that in a way which you feel comfortable with in terms of tokens or security or authentication?
Thank you.
Yeah, huge amounts of challenges, but opportunity, as you say, and it's going to change so quickly. I was looking back at some screen grabs of responses to prompts from, 2 years ago, and it was just my prompts were quite basic then, but also the results have moved on significantly. We wrap up our conversations with a few rapid fire questions, after which Alistair and I'll just reflect on some of the things we've talked about today. But to get to the rapid fire round, Nick, one AI application that's made a big difference to your day to day.
Ooh. Um, in a work sense, actually, the one that I'm using, so I mentioned Copilot, and I think Copilot is amazing, but the one I'm probably using now more is the Amazon Q capability to help me interrogate data in a way that I wasn't before. So we actually, I use that internally to make a better. I think we've always been pretty good in our business about dashboarding within our business to understand what's going on with our users, our customers, other elements of our business, just how it operates. But Amazon Q's just taken it to a different level. It's absolutely incredible. It's enabled me to get the answers much more quickly, and in a way that means I don't need to be as big an egghead about data querying as I used to be.
That's
My
great.
wife would say I still am, but that's another topic.
That's great to hear, and not one I think we've heard before on this podcast. So thank you. So the next question we always ask is, do you have a podcast or book or other resource recommendation for listeners to check out?
Ooh, so I love my books, and I'm a voracious reader, always have been. But I'd probably recommend a podcast at the moment because relatively recently fallen in love with a podcast called Acquired.com. And I don't know if you, a listener, looking at Heather's reaction there, it sounds like you might like it too, Heather. For listeners that haven't seen it or aren't aware of it, it's absolutely fantastic. Been stretching for some 14 seasons or something now. So there's a lot of back catalogue if you're going to go into it. And essentially, it's an investigation, company by company, into some of the world's greatest companies about their history and how they started, the mistakes they made, the good decisions they made in the early days, when they maybe almost went bust 10 years in and stuff. The Nvidia story in particular is a fact, given where Nvidia is right at the time of us recording this in terms of their share price. It's been a fantastic and fascinating story. So I highly recommend acquired.com.
I'll
Second that.
I'll be sure to check it out. It's not on my list. It wasn't on my list, but it is now.
My favorite podcast they've done was on Costco. It was so
Wow.
great, and it's so relatable for our industry because it's a great story of vertical integration gone right. Um, Biggest AI fail, Nick?
Oh, gosh, that's a difficult one. What that I've seen out there, because I mean, we've certainly had some internally where we've hoped for stuff that a capability for internal use is going to work, and it hasn't really delivered on that. So we've got a few scars. Um, I, to be honest, at the moment, and the jury's out on whether it's actually a fail, and it might work out okay, but I think Apple's speed of response and reaction to AI has been surprisingly late to the party, stroke slow. I think that they had, for my money, they had probably almost the best opportunity out there, given that most of us are carrying around devices that, well, is either one of theirs or an Android. And so much data. I thought that was a gimme, and it feels like they missed the boat a little.
Oh, I am absolutely with you there, Nick. As someone who got onto the iOS beta, changed my location to be in the US just to try out Apple Intelligence, to turn out that it wasn't at all intelligent. And now the action button on my phone takes me to the Chat GPT chat because it's so much better.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so yeah, no, definitely agree with you there. Um, well, that's pretty much all we got time for today. So thank you so much, Nick, for your time this morning. It's been really interesting, really helpful. Yeah, thank you very much.
Loved it, Alistair. Loved it, Heather. Thank you very much for inviting me, and look forward to the next one.
That was a really, really fascinating conversation with Nicky Tuck. He's very thoughtful, knowledgeable, and runs one of the bigger tech firms in our sector, with lots of time spent in Australia and the US recently. So great to get his thoughts. Alistair, I want to hear from you, but first, two things from me. He categorized the types of AI. So generative AI gets a lot of attention, but he mentioned generative AI, RPA, robotic processing automation, and machine learning. And I thought those three categories were interesting, partly because of the examples he used in each of them. So for coding, um, that anybody can write code now, was really interesting, and the opportunities in his business with that. RPA, the challenge of rekeying, the challenge of different levels of APIs. Everyone says they have an API, but you will have ingested some of those APIs and know that they don't all work as promised. And the opportunity for RPA to automate some of that rekeying and bring data from system to system, I think, is really interesting. And then machine learning about interrogating data, which takes me to my second. I thought what he was saying about Amazon Q is really interesting, not necessarily because of Amazon Q, but because of that shift towards natural language queries. And I'm somebody who struggles to get data out of systems, even though I'm a data analyst by training, and being able to ask the question I want rather than thinking, this is the question, this is the outcome, but where do I need to get the data? What do I need to look for? Being able to ask that in a natural language way, I think is really, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the couple of bits that stuck out from Nick, the first was kind of hearing about the due diligence that intelliflo feel they need to do, but also that they don't feel they can then give a little gold star that says this has passed our due diligence. And I thought he gave a couple of really good practical ideas to advise firms on what they can do. But I'm definitely guilty as a customer of thinking, why can't they just let me open up all of my data to this tool that I want to use? And so hearing a sensible reason why is actually quite interesting. I was also quite surprised to hear that the US, isn't bounding on ahead, and the US advice world hasn't automated absolutely everything, and all the advisors are sitting on beaches in the Caribbean at this point, letting the AI do the work for them. So I was actually expecting to hear that there'd be a bit more of that. So that's interesting too, and maybe we're not lagging behind as far as our British sensibilities make us think we are.
I don't think so. I mean, my experience of having spent a bit of time in the US with advice firms last spring was that where they're thinking about using AI is more in customer acquisition. And a lot of those firms are really businesses rather than advice practices. And I think the UK actually could use a little bit of that thinking to be more not sales oriented in a negative way, but just thinking about, what's the having a really defined professional process for bringing in new customers and not being shy about that. The other thing I wanted to mention was he mentioned the entire advice journey and how AI can play a role across the entire journey. And I think he's absolutely right. But one thing I've been learning in a piece of work we're doing now on advice at scale is that firms are thinking you need algorithmic advice with AI used at points in the journey that aren't about the advice generation, because you can't have the advice delivered in a black box that can't be queried. You have to ensure consistency. So I think there's some challenges there around, there's a bit of realism we need to apply to how much AI will be able to be used to automate advice. It's not the advice that will be automated, but aspects of the process that could be speeded up. Even if you can reinvent and reimagine the way advice is done with new technology, absolutely. But that's not a full end-to-end AI process, in my view.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Listen, Alistair, I've had a huge amount of fun hosting this series with you. You've been an amazing co-host, somebody who actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to AI. And so thank you for joining me in these last 8 episodes and for joining me as the co-host for our AI Lab. Our next meeting of AI Lab is the 29th of April. We've got a link in the show notes if you would like to get more information. Our sponsors for that are Aviva, Fidelity, SS&C, and Salesforce. So thank you to them. The next series for the podcast will be recordings of presentations from Next Wealth Live, our annual conference. That conference happens on the 18th of March. We have about 50 tickets left, so don't delay if you want to be there. Thank you to Artemis Irvin, our podcast producer. And Alistair, thanks again.
Thank you, Heather. I've had an absolute blast. Speak to you soon.